He bought her like an animal, but she was not what he expected. The room was dark and cold, and only one screen was glowing in front of Drake. He was sitting in his chair staring at a secret auction that only a few people in the world knew about. The auction was not for gold or weapons or land. It was for something more dangerous, more alive. The screen showed a cage. Inside that cage was a woman. She was tall with wild hair and golden eyes that looked like fire. Her body was strong like a soldier, but her face looked lost and broken. The text under the screen said, Subject A13, Amazon female, untamed, starting bid, 10 million. Drake was not rich, but he had saved money for something big, and this was it. He clicked on the bid button. He waited, and then congratulations, the screen flashed and the cage disappeared. 3 days later, a large metal box arrived at Drake's hidden lab in the forest. He signed the paper, and the guards left without a word. He opened the box slowly, and the smell of iron and dirt came out. Inside was the same woman from the auction. Her hands were tied with electric cuffs and her feet were chained. She did not move. She only looked at him with those burning golden eyes. Drake spoke softly, I am not here to hurt you. No reply. He moved closer. She flinched. He stopped. I will not touch you if you don't want me to. Still silence. He left food and water near her and walked away that night. Drake watched her through the glass. She did not eat. She did not sleep. She only stared at the wall. He checked her file. It said she was captured near the Amazon forest 3 months ago. But something was wrong. The numbers in her blood test were not human, not fully. He zoomed in on her eyes from the camera and paused. They looked too smart, too aware. Then it happened. She stood up, broke the food plate, and used the sharp edge to cut her cuffs. Drake ran to stop her, but she was already out of the box. He raised his hands. I am not your enemy. She looked at him. Her voice was soft and broken, but clear. Why did you buy me? Drake froze. You can talk. She nodded. Then she pointed to his chest. You are not like them. He asked them. She said, the ones who put me in the cage, the ones who burned my name. He asked, what is your name? She said, I don't remember. They called me A13, but I had another name before. I know it. I feel it. But they erased it. Drake felt cold. He said, I will help you find it. She said, why? He said, I want the truth, and maybe because I don't like cages either. She looked at him for a long time. Then she sat down on the floor. He offered her a blanket. She did not take it, but she did not break it either. Later that night, while Drake was fixing her blood data on his computer, he found a hidden code. It was a tracker. Someone was watching her location. Someone knew she was here. Suddenly the screen turned black. A message popped up. Return subject, A13. Her face, termination. Drake stared at the message. His heart was racing. He turned around. She was standing behind him. Her eyes were wide. She had seen it too. She whispered, they are coming. Drake asked, who are they? She said, people with white masks and cold hands. They used to test me like a rat. They gave me pain to see how much I could take. Then they said I was perfect, too perfect. They called me their weapon. Drake asked, what do they want now? She said, they want me dead before I remember who I am. Because if I remember, I will destroy them all. Then she walked to the window, looked at the stars above, and said something strange. I know those stars, but I have never seen them before. Drake looked at her. She was not just strong. She was something else, something made but not born, something lost but not broken. And in that moment he knew he had not bought an animal. He had found a mystery, and that mystery was about to change everything. The night was silent, but the fear inside Drake's chest was screaming louder than any sound he had ever heard. He could not sleep because her words kept running in his mind. They want me dead before I remember who I am. He sat near the table staring at the tracker he found inside her blood report. A small chip hidden deep inside her body, sending signals every second. He held his head between his hands and tried to think of what to do next. But before he could stand, she walked into the room quietly like a shadow, without chains, without fear. She looked at him and spoke slowly. I remember more now. Drake turned to her and asked what she remembered. She said her memories came in flashes, not full pictures, but small broken moments. She saw white walls and cold lights and voices speaking numbers. She saw needles entering her arms and strange machines scanning her body. And she saw people in white suits smiling like devils. They said she was special, she was different. She was a project, not a person. Drake felt a chill in his bones as she said those words because everything he believed was falling apart. He opened his laptop and started digging deeper into the auction site. He hacked through layers of firewalls and fake pages until he found something hidden. A folder marked Project Amazon. Inside were documents, pictures, and videos that made his blood freeze. There were other girls like her, strong, tall, fast, and wild, but all of them were dead, except her. Subject 13, the first one who survived and the only one who escaped. Drake looked at her and asked how she got away. She said she remembered fire, an explosion, and running into the jungle with blood on her hands. She said something guided her out, not a voice, but a feeling. A voice inside her heart telling her to survive. Drake knew now that she was not born in a jungle. She was created in a lab. Grown, not raised. Built, not born. And her life was never hers to begin with. Suddenly the computer screen flickered again. A new message appeared. Last warning. Subject: a 13 must be returned. Drake stared at the message, then shut the laptop and turned to her. He said, "We have to remove the tracker, or they will find you again." She nodded. He took her to the basement where he kept old medical tools and machines. He asked her to lie down. She did not flinch, not even when the scanner found the chip near her spine. He said, "This will hurt." She looked at him and replied softly, "I have felt worse." With careful hands he removed the chip. She did not cry. She only closed her eyes and whispered a name. But not her name, a name from her memory, Elora. Drake asked who was that. She said she did not know. Maybe someone she lost. He placed the chip inside a lead box and burned it with acid. No more signals, no more tracking. He thought they were safe now, but he was wrong. The next morning Drake heard a sound outside the lab, like a drone but heavier. He opened the window and saw something hovering in the sky. A black machine shaped like a bird, but with no wings. Its eye was red, and it scanned the house slowly. Drake ran to her and said, "We have to go now." She was already ready. She grabbed a bag filled with water tools and wires. They ran through the forest behind the lab. Thorns scratched their skin, and branches slapped their faces. But they did not stop. They ran until the trees opened. To a cliff below was a river, fast, cold, and wide. Drake hesitated. She did not. She jumped. He followed without thinking. The water pulled them far downstream before they reached the shore. Wet, cold, and breathless, they crawled onto the rocks. She looked at the sky and pointed. Another drone was coming. Drake pulled out a signal jammer and activated it. The drone blinked, then fell into the trees like a dead bird. They moved again, deeper into the woods, until they found an old cabin, half broken but hidden. They entered and locked the door. Drake sat down and laughed without joy. She smiled a little and asked why he laughed. He said because nothing made sense anymore. Then she touched his hand and said something that made his heart stop. "I think I was made to kill people like you." Drake looked into her eyes and saw pain, not anger, fear, not hate. He asked if she wanted to kill him now. She said no, because he saw her as a person, not a weapon. He asked what she wanted now. She said she wanted to know who made her and why. She wanted answers. She wanted justice. And maybe she wanted to be free. Outside, the wind blew through the trees. Inside, the fire crackled softly, and for the first time since he bought her, Drake realized he had not saved her. She had saved him. The wind was strong, and the sky was dark and heavy with silent warnings, as if the world itself knew that something terrible was about to happen. Drake stood near the cabin door, holding a broken radio in one hand and a rusted flashlight in the other, while the Amazon woman sat by the fire trying to stay calm. As her memories returned in strange, painful pieces, she remembered glass walls, cold metal tables, voices without faces, and endless screaming. Her body shook, but her eyes stayed sharp and steady, as if some part of her had never forgotten how to survive. Drake placed the radio down and looked at her with a quiet fear in his eyes. Because the signal jammer had stopped working, and the air was no longer safe. They were being hunted. Again, he whispered that they needed to leave before nightfall, because machines never slept. And men without faces were always close. She nodded and stood without a word. But before they could move, a sound filled the air. It was deep and metallic. Like thunder wrapped in metal. Drake opened the door and saw something in the sky. It was not a bird, not a plane, not even a drone. It was something new, something made only for one purpose: to find her and take her back. She looked up and said softly, "They found me." Drake grabbed his bag and ran with her into the woods. Every step was heavy and loud on the wet ground. But they kept moving through the trees, over stones, under branches. Across cold, shallow streams, the machine followed from above. Silent but deadly. Suddenly the trees exploded behind them, and fire lit the sky. A steel sphere dropped from the machine and burst like a bomb. Flames chased them. Smoke filled the air. Drake fell and hit his head on a rock, but she picked him up with one hand like he was nothing but a feather and pulled him to safety behind a fallen log. She asked if he could run. He nodded, though his face was white. They moved again, faster, wilder. Then she stopped. In the distance she heard something else, footsteps. Not metal, not robotic, human, but wrong, she told Drake to stay low and crept toward the sound. What she saw made her freeze. A figure stood near the trees, tall like her, built like her, but not like her. This one wore a black suit with red lights and a metal collar around her neck. Her face was cold and blank. Her eyes were gold but darker. This was another Amazon, but not free. She was still under control. The woman turned and looked directly at her. For a moment nothing moved. Then the controlled Amazon charged forward like a bullet through trees. She swung with perfect strength and speed. The fight began. Drake watched from behind a tree, holding his breath as the two powerful women clashed like thunder in the forest. Each blow cracked the air, each kick shook the ground. They were sisters in blood, but enemies in war. She tried to speak to her, tried to remind her, "We are the same. We are not weapons, we are people." But the other one did not answer. She only fought harder. Drake saw something glowing on her neck, a red chip. He shouted to the Amazon woman, "The collar, break the collar." She understood, and with one perfect move grabbed the other by the shoulders, spun around, and slammed her into a rock. Then she tore off the collar. The red light blinked twice, then faded. The other Amazon gasped and fell to her knees. She looked around, confused and scared. Then she saw the woman in front of her and whispered, "Lyra." Drake heard the name and froze. Lyra, her name. She had remembered the other Amazon held her hand and cried without words. Drake stepped closer and asked what her name was. She replied slowly, "Mira." Drake looked at both of them and asked how many more were out there. Mira answered, "Too many, some still sleeping, some still hunting, some already dead." Lyra asked where the lab was, where they were made. Mira pulled a broken piece of metal from her suit and showed them a map etched into its surface. The location of the main facility, the place where it all began. Drake said they should go there and find the truth and stop whoever was doing this. Lyra said, "No, we do not go there to stop them. We go there to end them." They moved again, now as three. Not prey but hunters. In the sky the machine circled once more, but this time it did not see fear, it saw purpose, it saw danger. Because the woman it once hunted was no longer running. She was remembering, she was rising. And those who created her would soon face what they feared most. Their own creation, alive, free, and angry. Asterisk. The air was thick with silence, and the trees stood like watchers as Lyra walked beside Mira and Drake through the deep woods that led toward the mountains where the lab was hidden behind layers of rock steel and secrets that no one was ever meant to find. Drake held the broken map tightly and glanced around every few steps as if the trees themselves might open and reveal another hunter from the past. Mira walked with slow, careful steps, her body still marked by scars and burns that told stories without words, and her eyes carried a storm that had not yet passed. Lyra said nothing for hours, her thoughts heavy with old pain and new questions, and something else that kept pulling at her heart like a whisper too faint to understand. They stopped at a small clearing when the sun began to fall, and Mira sat on a rock staring into the ground while Drake started a fire using dried leaves and a lighter that barely worked. Lyra walked to the edge of the clearing and looked into the trees, her ears catching something distant, a sound too soft to be wind and too sharp to be leaves. She turned and said, "Someone is following us." Drake stood and reached for his tool bag. Mira grabbed a metal rod from her belt and moved beside Lyra. Then they saw her. Another woman stepped out from the shadows, taller than both. Her hair was long and black like night. Her eyes glowed red and her body was covered in strange armor that moved with her skin like a living shell. She said nothing. As she stepped forward, her face blank, her hands closed, Lyra took a slow step forward and asked her name. No answer. Drake whispered that she might be another controlled Amazon like Mira was. Mira shook her head and said, "No, she is something else. Something newer, something worse." The woman lifted her arm and pointed at Lyra. Her voice came out like metal in smoke. "You are marked for deletion." Lyra stepped back and said, "I am free. I am not your enemy." But the woman leapt forward like a machine. And the fight began. Drake ran to cover as the three collided in the middle of the clearing. Lyra blocked the first strike and kicked her away, but the woman spun mid-air and landed like a cat without sound. Mira joined the fight with fire in her hands, swinging the rod like a blade. The woman did not bleed. Every hit made sparks. Her skin was not skin. It was armor made in the lab. Drake searched his bag for something, anything that could help. He pulled out a small EMP device and shouted to Lyra, "Get her close to the tree." Lyra understood and moved fast, dodging the attacks and leading the armored woman to the big oak tree at the edge of the clearing. Drake pressed the EMP pin through it. It exploded in a flash of blue. The woman screamed for the first time as her body shook and her armor cracked. Mira jumped and knocked her to the ground. Lyra pulled the helmet off her head. Underneath was a face beautiful and broken. Tears ran from her red eyes. She whispered one word. "Nova." Lyra asked, "Is that your name?" She nodded. Myra asked why she was hunting us. Nova said, "They told me you were threats. They said you killed the others. They showed me lies." Drake asked how many more like her were out there. Nova said, "More than you think. Some like me. Some worse." Lyra asked who gave the orders. Nova looked at her and said, "One named Dr. Adrix." Drake froze. That was the name in the files. The lead scientist of Project Amazon. Lyra stood and looked at the map again. She said, "We go to the lab now. No more hiding. No more waiting." Nova said she would help. Lyra asked why. Nova said, "Because you saved me when you could have killed me." Mira smiled for the first time and helped her up. They moved as four now, each step a promise, each breath a warning. In the distance, the mountains stood like giants. Drake felt fear growing in his chest, but he followed because he had seen something in their eyes. Something stronger than fear. Hope. Lyra walked at the front, her mind sharp and focused and her heart burning. She remembered cages and needles and screams. But now she also remembered names and faces and the feeling of being seen. Not as a weapon, not as a thing, but as someone real, someone alive. The stars began to shine above them as they walked toward the place where everything began, the place where they were made, the place where they would write their own ending. And this time they were not running, they were coming. The mountain rose like a wall before them, and its shadow fell over the forest as if the earth itself was warning them to turn back. But Lyra kept walking with her fists clenched and her eyes locked on the rocky path that led to the place where she had been born, not from a mother, but from machines and experiments and cold hands without kindness. Mira walked behind her with slow steps and looked up at the dark clouds moving over the mountain as if the sky itself wanted to hide what waited. At the top, Nova moved like a ghost with her head low and her voice silent, as if the closer they got the more her memories returned, and each one was sharper than the last. Drake followed with the map in one hand and a small scanner in the other. And his heart beat louder than his footsteps, because he knew this was not just a lab, it was a graveyard of science and power and broken promises. They reached a narrow path that cut into the side of the mountain and moved along it in silence as Wind howled around them, like voices lost in time. After 2 hours, the path ended at a large rock wall covered in vines and moss. But Nova stepped forward and placed her hand on the stone and whispered a code that came from somewhere deep in her. Memory. The wall opened slowly, and the sound it made was like a sigh from the earth itself. Inside was a tunnel lit by old red lights that blinked and flickered like dying stars. They walked in and the door closed behind them, and for a moment, the darkness was complete. Then the lights came on one by one and revealed a hallway of glass and steel and broken screens with wires hanging like dead snakes from the ceiling. Drake looked at the walls and saw faded symbols of the company that once ruled this place, and he whispered its name like a curse. Ether Corp. Lyra stared at the floor where red stains still marked the tiles, and flashes of old pain hit her like fire behind her eyes. She saw herself in chains. She saw Mira screaming. She saw Nova strapped to a table, and she saw others, so many others now gone. They moved deeper into the lab and past rooms filled with shattered machines and broken capsules and empty beds that still held the shape of bodies long removed. Room they found a screen still working, and Drake wiped the dust and played the last video file. The image showed Dr. Adric standing in front of a group of men and women in white coats with a cold smile on his face. He spoke about the future of war and the end of natural evolution and the birth of controlled power. He called the women subjects, not soldiers, not human subjects. Then the video ended with one last line: terminate all unstable units before activation of Phase 2. Mira clenched her fists and punched the screen until it cracked. Nova turned and said she remembered where his office was. They moved quickly through the winding halls until they reached a steel door with a handprint scanner. Nova placed her hand on the panel, and the door opened with a hiss. Inside was a room filled with screens, papers, files, and one large chair that faced the window. Drake rushed to the desk and grabbed the files marked confidential and started reading while Lyra walked to the chair and slowly turned it around. What she saw made her heart freeze. Dr. Adric sat in the chair, but he was not alive. His skin was gray and dry, and wires ran from his neck to the chair, like roots from a dying tree. Nova said he must have uploaded his mind into the system before his body failed. Mira found a panel behind the wall and opened it to reveal servers still running. Drake said they needed to shut it down or he could still control other Amazons remotely. Lyra stared at the lifeless body and whispered that this was not science. This was madness. Nova placed a small charge on the server core and set the timer. They grabbed as many files as they could and ran back through the halls as the lights flickered and alarms began to scream. The lab shook, dust fell from the ceiling, flames sparked from the wires, and behind them, the place that once called itself the future of evolution began to collapse. They reached the exit just as the explosion roared behind them and fire swallowed the mountain from inside. Outside, the sky had cleared and the sun broke through the clouds. Like a sign that something had ended, Drake looked at Lyra and asked, "What now?" She said, "Now we find the others who are still alive and we tell them the truth." Nova stepped forward and said, "We give them names." Mira said, "We give them choices." Lyra looked at the rising smoke and whispered, "We give them freedom." The sun was high, but the light felt cold as Lyra stood on the hill watching the smoke rise from the mountain where the lab had burned and where their past had finally turned to ash and silence. But her heart knew the fight was not over, because fire could not erase what had been built in secret and buried in data. Drake sat beside a broken tree holding the stolen files and reading through page after page with wide eyes and shaking hands, because each word revealed something worse than the last, and the truth was no longer hiding in shadows. Nova stood near the river washing the blood from her arms in silence, and her eyes looked lost in thoughts that had no end, because freedom felt heavy on her shoulders. Mira walked around the trees keeping watch with a metal rod in her hand and a fire in her chest, because she had tasted revenge. And now she hungered for justice. They had destroyed the lab but not the system. They had escaped the cage but not the hunters. They had broken the chains but not the plan. Drake looked up from the files and said the program was bigger than one lab. He said there were other sites. He said Phase 2 was not stopped. He said the next version of Amazons would not be grown in labs, but printed in machines and fed with false memories, and controlled by a new artificial system called Helix. Lyra listened and felt something dark rise inside her, because they had been real, and they had felt pain, and they had cried, and they had fought to live, and now the same. Evil wanted to make copies without soul or past or choice. Mira said we stop it. Nova said we destroy every place they hide. Drake said we find the hub where Helix lives, and we shut it down before it wakes up. Lyra said we move now. They traveled for 2 days through the woods, over rivers, across silent highways that once carried people, but now carried ghosts. They followed the signals hidden in the stolen files and reached an old military base with no flag and no guards and no noise. They stood at the edge of the gate and stared at the empty towers and dark buildings and broken glass. Drake checked the scanner and said the core was under the ground. Nova said she knew the way. They moved in silence through the base and found a hidden door under the mess hall covered in dust and dried leaves. Inside was a long metal tunnel, lit by soft blue lights and filled with a soft humming sound that felt like breath. They walked slowly, watching every shadow, every wall, every sound. Lyra led the way with her hands ready and her eyes sharp. They reached a wide room with a single console in the center and screens floating in the air. The system came to life and spoke in a voice soft like wind, but sharp like glass. Welcome to Helix. Lyra said nothing. Nova said nothing. Drake stepped forward and typed the emergency shutdown code. The system paused and then said, error, access denied, you are not authorized. Drake tried again and again, but the system blocked every move. Mira stepped forward and smashed the console with her rod. The lights flickered, but the voice laughed. That was useless. Helix does not live in one place. Helix lives in the net. Lyra stared at the screen and said, you are just a shadow. We are the storm. Then the floor opened and machines rose from below, tall, thin silver figures with eyes that glowed red and hands that turned into blades. Drake ran behind cover. Nova jumped and kicked the first one to the wall. Mira swung her rod and broke another into pieces. Lyra moved like fire and steel, smashing one with her fists and flipping through two more. The room became a battlefield. Sparks flew, metal screamed, blood mixed with smoke. Drake found a backup switch near the wall and shouted to Lyra. She nodded and covered him while he ran. He opened the panel and found a single red lever. He pulled it. The lights exploded. The machines froze. The voice stopped. Then silence. Only their breathing filled the room. Helix was offline. The danger was not over, but the plan was broken. Lyra stood in the middle of the room with pieces of machines around her and said, we send a message. Nova asked what kind of message. Lyra said, we show the world what they did to us. Mira said, we tell our story. Drake said, we warn them before it happens again. They gathered the files and videos and left the base as the sun began to fall again. They uploaded everything to the net, and within hours the truth spread like fire. People watched. People asked how it happened. Lyra watched the screens and felt something shift in the air. They were not shadows anymore, they were voices, and the world had started to listen. The night sky was full of stars, but none of them felt peaceful as Lyra stood on the roof of the old train station watching the roads below, where lights moved like waves and people marched with fear and fire in their hearts, because the truth had reached them and the lies had cracked open like eggs, spilling darkness into the world. Drake stood beside her with a small radio in his hand and worry in his eyes, because signals from across the globe were now warning of something bigger than machines and deeper than science. Mira sat on a broken bench, cleaning her blade with slow hands, as if sharpening her thoughts with every wipe, and her silence spoke louder than any scream. Nova leaned against the wall with her arms crossed and her face set like stone, because she had seen what was coming, and she knew it would not stop until someone stood and said enough. They had shut down Helix, but only for a while. They had burned the lab, but not the idea. The people who built gods in secret had already moved on to the next phase. Drake said the satellites were falling and the sky was not safe. He said the last code from the system was not a shutdown, but a signal to someone beyond the planet. Lyra listened and her breath slowed because something old inside her had always whispered that her pain did not begin on Earth. Nova said the Helix code was not born here. It was found, it was alien, it was awakened. Lyra looked up and said, then let it come. Let it see what it made. Suddenly, the air shifted, the stars blinked, a sound deeper than thunder rolled across the sky. A light opened in the clouds like a crack in the heavens, and something began to fall. It was not a ship, not a meteor, not a drone. It was alive, it was calling it. Was them. Drake shouted for everyone to move as the thing landed outside the city, and the earth shook like a drum under a giant fist. They ran through the streets past people screaming and sirens howling and walls breaking. Lyra led the way with her heart burning and her mind clear. They reached the edge of the city where the fire had not yet touched. They saw it, tall as a mountain and shaped like a twisted tree made of flesh and wire and light. It did not speak with words, but everyone heard its voice in their heads. It said, return the subjects. It said, surrender the knowledge. It said, serve. Lyra stepped forward and said, no. You made us without asking. You broke us without guilt. You called us weapons, but we became more. The creature reached for her, but she moved faster than light and struck it with a power that came not from her fists, but from her will. Nova followed her into the battle with her hands glowing like stars and her feet moving like waves. Mira roared as she leapt into the sky and brought her blade down with all the strength of rage and love and pain. Drake sent a signal to the hidden resistance across the world. People rose, people fought, people believed. The creature screamed and lashed out with arms that turned into fire, but Lyra caught the fire in her hands and bent it around her like armor. She looked into the heart of the thing and saw not a god but a program, not a mind but a mirror. It had no soul, only code. She reached inside and tore it apart. From the core, the light exploded, the ground cracked, the sky turned white, and then silence. No wind, no sound, only breathing, only life. Lyra stood in the ashes with smoke rising from her skin and her eyes glowing with the truth of what she had become. Not a weapon, not a victim, not a creation, but a choice. Drake walked to her and asked, what now? She said, now we begin again. Nova said, we teach them. Mira said, we protect them. Drake asked, who will lead? Lyra looked at the people gathering behind the broken walls and the ruined streets and said, no one leads, everyone chooses. She walked to the crowd and raised her voice. We were built in secret. We were raised in cages. We were trained for war. But we chose peace. And now you must choose to. Silence fell again. Then someone clapped. Then someone shouted. Then the city echoed with voices. The stars returned. The night healed. And for the first time, the world belonged to everyone, even the ones once made to destroy it.